Support for 10,000 Things comes from Third Place Books. With 3 store locations in Seattle, Washington, Third Place Books offers a wide selection of books, gifts, and over 250 author readings a year, in-store or online at thirdplacebooks.com.
This podcast is free, and it's accessible to everyone thanks to support from listeners like you. If you value this show, please consider supporting its production by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute to give, and you'll be helping to support the production of this podcast. Make a donation at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thanks!
This episode of 10,000 Things is about the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle. It was recorded before 26 members of its 52-person staff walked out on May 22nd in protest of a new exhibition entitled Confronting Hate Together. Staff returned May 29th, and leadership continues to work to resolve the dispute. As of June 18th, the museum is operating with limited hours. If you'd like to know more, we're providing links to KUOW's coverage in our episode notes. As you're about to hear, the Wing is a beloved Seattle institution that has been no stranger to turmoil and disruption. Regardless, its strong relationship to the community has allowed it to grow and thrive. I grew up in a community in Southern California that didn't have a Chinatown by the time that my family arrived in the late 1970s. Racism had forced its displacement multiple times over its nearly 100-year existence. And when the last living resident of Riverside's Chinatown passed away, the city bulldozed and destroyed what is considered today an archaeologically significant site. It's a big deal that Seattle has its own Asian American district. Here it's called the CID, the Chinatown-International District. The CID has a rich history that is a foundational part of our city's identity. The immigrants who built the railroads which connected the Northwest lived and labored here, despite being forced to move. First, by a vigilante mob during the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and later by city growth and redevelopment. The residents of the CID were still able to put down roots, even though they were often excluded from citizenship, unfairly taxed, displaced, and victim to extreme violence. People of many backgrounds lived in or visited the CID to be reminded of the sounds and flavors of home, or to feel for a fleeting moment some sense of belonging. The beating heart of the CID is the Wing Luke Museum. It's an anchor in the neighborhood. I was introduced to the Wing very soon after I arrived in Seattle. It's the only Pan-Asian art and history museum in the United States. The Wing represents the immigrant diasporic experience, and within its walls you'll see displays that highlight the stories and histories of diverse groups of people who have come here during different waves of immigration. There's even a historic bachelor's hotel upstairs that was recreated and preserved to bring the early experiences of our city's immigrants to life. As a graduate student in museum studies, I was one of many volunteers to help process and catalog the museum's artifacts as it prepared for reopening in 2008 after it moved to a new site, the East Yick building. This building brings the neighborhood together. It unites history with the present. And it's important because it's a place that represents multiple histories of immigration. It puts the Asian diaspora and their cultures of origin on proud display while interrogating the challenges that these communities face. But it took a unique and unwavering vision to transform the museum into a true place for community. And even now, the Wing still faces outside threats. This is 10,000 Things, a podcast about modern-day artifacts of Asian American life and the stories they reveal. I'm Shin-Yi Pai. Today, the East Yick building.
Support for 10,000 Things comes from Third Place Books. With 3 store locations in Seattle, Washington, Third Place Books offers a wide selection of books, gifts, and over 250 author readings a year, in-store or online at thirdplacebooks.com.
Hey, my name's Claire McGrain, and I'm a producer for Seattle Now, KUOW's local news podcast. There is a lot happening in our region, and it's a lot of work to keep track of it all. We'll get you caught up on the latest news and take a deep dive into something happening around the city, all in under 15 minutes. Get a morning walk-in or grab a cup of coffee and start your day with us. Learn something new and connect with our city by searching for Seattle Now wherever you get your podcasts.
Seattle's Wing-Luke Museum started out in 1967 as an Asian folk historical museum, created to protect and preserve antiquities from Asia. This wasn't unusual. A lot of museums were established to put cultural objects on display. The Wing hired a community member named Ron Chu as executive director in 1991. Ron didn't know anything about museums. When Ron took over, he had a bold vision for what the Wing could be.
I really wanted to not focus on the objects as the first step, but really about stories and about how those stories guide and inform what was happening around us in the present day.
Ron had been a journalist for the International Examiner, a local activist newspaper, before moving over to lead the museum. He knew the stories of the CID from years of reporting in the community, and from growing up and working alongside his father as a busboy at the Hong Kong restaurant.
A good journalist has good sources, and they're able to have conversations and gather information. So I took that training and perspective into my work.
For Ron, the museum objects were secondary to the people of the CID. He wanted to preserve and tell their stories. He wanted to listen to them, not experts.
I felt the lived experience of community elders or folks who maybe were student activists. They could become our scholars. They could help us create these exhibitions. And so this community advisory committee model was formed where the exhibits weren't created by museum curators, but by committees of folks who were assembled from the community.
The community would produce the exhibits they wanted to see. Ron's approach was met with skepticism from the mainstream museum community. They feared that the best practices that had guided museums for more than 100 years were being thrown aside by a maverick outsider.
I wasn't respecting the traditions of the museum field. Some of the early volunteers who came to the museum were not from the API community and were well-intentioned, but they couldn't see what I was doing. On some occasions, I would go back in the collection, and we had old documents, papers, and I would touch documents without wearing those white gloves. And they were shocked. But, I was sort of making a point to them in some ways that these things that we make special or different are really our things. And we shouldn't be afraid that they will disintegrate. It was about seeing things very wholly differently. And I think that frees you then to approach your work very differently.
Ron wasn't afraid to shake things up. In fact, he thought it was a good thing that doing so helped free people to think about and see their history differently. The first real test of Ron's unique approach was a revisitation of Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the removal and transfer of Japanese Americans who were sent into American concentration camps during World War II.
Remember, 2/3 of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated were American-born citizens. They had been stripped of their rights and liberties in a way that was devastating. They never shared that with their children and grandchildren because it was so traumatic.
Ron applied his community as experts approach and invited people from the neighborhood into the process. They could co-create a show that they wanted to support, hold a conversation that they wanted to have. Word spread throughout the CID, and many people offered their memories, experiences, and stories. The exhibit included more community voices and welcomed multiple perspectives in ways that few museums had ever done before, and there was depth and nuance to those conversations.
We had 4 generations of folks talking about how a government action profoundly changed their lives. So it was transformative.
The exhibit had lines out the door. So many people wanted to see the show that the wing had to extend the run of the exhibition, and Ron had a huge realization.
I knew then and there that what we were doing couldn't be contained within the small former auto garage that was the museum's home.
The museum needed to expand. It needed to find a new home. So Ron started the search to find a bigger site for the museum that would allow the wing to grow. He began by looking at who owned which buildings in the CID. He initiated discussions and assessed the options. Leaving the CID would have meant separation from the community home. But within the CID, many of the buildings that had been built by the original pioneers of Chinatown were in bad shape, with a few exceptions. The East Yick building was one. The Yick building had been built in 1910 by a collective group of early investors in the neighborhood. It had once been a hotel. Their descendants still owned the building, and some of them ran businesses, like a restaurant or an import-export company out of the East Yick. Others lived far away. Ron would need to get every single stakeholder's approval, and all he had was a list of the original owners to go on. A list with over 200 names on it.
There were some big names: Kun Dip, Qin Jihe, Qin Qinghok. Qin Qinghok, by the way, was the first Chinese settler in Seattle. Came before the city was incorporated as a city. Kun Dip was honorary Chinese consul.
Ron started calling people and knocking on doors and asking around. He used his local knowledge, his investigative skills, and his contacts to find the descendants of the 200 original building owners. He spent several years peeling back the layers of history.
I just remember going and talking to so many people. It was just endless.
Ron spoke about how significant it could be to build a larger museum that could connect the past, the present, and the future of the neighborhood. A place where the sacrifices, hardships, and activism of the ancestors could be acknowledged and connected to the vitality of the present-day community. Ron tracked each person down. He sold each one on the vision of remodeling the East Yick and preserving history for generations to come. Eventually, he got everyone to agree to sell. Then, he had to raise the money, $23 million, or more like $32 million in today's dollars, to fund the purchase and renovation. At that time, the CID was suffering economically. But Ron buckled down and went to work. He spent 5 years fundraising for the Wing-Luk's new home, and again, working with the community served them all well.
We built a grassroots movement of people who believed in the institution because they saw that we were playing a role in helping them in their own lives to connect to a larger story. So we exceeded our total.
Ron felt that moving to the East Yick building wouldn't just be good for the Wing-Luk. It could help the struggling Chinatown-International district as well. The CID was experiencing the impacts of crime in the neighborhood. Many residents were not in a position to improve the buildings they lived or worked in. Ron thought this renovation could help remodel the future of the CID.
And so we put forth the notion, what if a museum wasn't simply about documenting things that were vanishing, but was an active agent in ensuring that the neighborhood survived?
The Wing-Luk bought and renovated all 60,000 square feet of the East Yick building. It reopened in 2008. But Ron says he never saw himself having an office there. He stepped aside after the fundraiser for new leadership to take over. He had done his part. And his visionary idea of making space for community remains part of the Wing-Luk today.
The Wing-Luk Museum maybe is a legacy of mine, but it's not my legacy to claim and hang on to, because so many others were part of that legacy. And so the legacy continues. It's not a static kind of thing that began and ended in one point in time.
The museum has been based out of the East Yick building for the last 16 years. It helped to inspire the renovation of other old buildings like the Louisa Hotel, home to the Prohibition-era Club Royale jazz nightclub. The museum was recognized by the Smithsonian and became a part of its legendary museum network, and is also an affiliate of the National Park Service. As a result, the Wing-Luke draws visitors nationwide to the neighborhood to experience its exhibitions on subjects like Asian American mental health and suicide, food insecurity, and activist histories. And when those visitors come to the CID, they spend their tourist dollars eating and shopping locally, or taking the Wing's neighborhood tours to develop an appreciation and understanding of a fragile but resilient neighborhood, and to see its past, present, and future. Today, it continues as a cornerstone of the CID, and it still collaborates with the community to build its exhibits.
I say, no neighborhood, no museum.
Joël Barakil-Tan serves as the current executive director of the Wing-Luke. If you approach the museum from 8th and King, you'll encounter the storefront of the Yick Mercantile first, a recreation of a traditional shop that served local residents for nearly a century. Canned Asian specialty items, herbal medicines, and jars of candied fruit fill the shelves. Upstairs, you'll see that the shop stored rice, but also provided space for newly arriving immigrants who might need a place to stay for the night. Inside the museum, you'll find a modern theater that presents talks and performances. The images on the large theater curtain were original advertisements of local businesses in Seattle's Japanese district. Look closely, and you'll find a hand-painted cat, an ad for Seattle's oldest Japanese restaurant, Maneki. Walk up the main staircase 2 full flights and you'll enter a light well where you'll walk beneath a cloud of suspended letters paired with an audio and visual art installation created by Susie Kozawa and Aaron Shea Palmer. Further into the building, you'll find a historic bachelor's hotel that recreates the single rooms and conditions under which the city's original immigrant laborers lived. The Wing connects the present, past, and future, and it still does so using its pioneering community advisory model.
Do you need a priest to negotiate that relationship between you and your higher power? No. We go right to the people knowing that they have a relationship to their own history, their own agency, their own sense of power, their own stories of victimhood, their own sense of vulnerability. And even more so when we gather people collectively, we start to see each other.
Not surprisingly, in this current age of racial equity and inclusion, the rest of the museum world has followed this path set by the Wing. The model is also taught in graduate-level museum courses at the University of Washington. The Wing's influence has never been stronger. But on September 14th, as we were planning this episode, that foundation was shaken. It was the night that Beyoncé performed in Seattle. People were leaving work early to get to her concert at Lehman Field. Queen Bee had encouraged her fans to show up in silver in honor of Virgo season. I ran into some of those fans on public transportation that night, and Joël himself was on a bus to Beacon Hill when he got the news.
Oh, honey, I was trying to get home. And then I get a call that this is happening right now. I was like, what? It didn't register.
Joël learned that someone had smashed the windows on the historic Canton Alley side of the building, while community members were still inside. This was an attack on the whole neighborhood, its present, its future, and its past. We're living in a time where many cities have been tested by social unrest, but this attack was no random act of vandalism.
After smashing 9 out of our 10 windows with a sledgehammer, claiming that the Chinese have ruined his life, the culprit also said that he wasn't leaving, that he wanted the police to come because he wanted to make a public statement.
This gave Joël chills. The attacker, a 76-year-old white man, wanted to spread his racist message and incite more acts of violence. But in that moment, the staff and community around the Wing-Luke Museum knew how to come together. It's what the community has been built around since the beginning. They sprang into action.
It was coordinated chaos in the way that there was just chaos that comes from that kind of violence. But it was pretty clear to everyone what needed to happen. We needed to keep everyone safe. We needed to clean up.
People swept up the broken glass from the shattered windows. Within minutes, someone started writing an email to Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell. A solidarity group immediately launched a healing circle. A texting tree was started. Meanwhile, flocks of people dressed in silver drifted by on their way to see Beyoncé at the stadium nearby.
You know, it's terrible beauty, but I almost wish I could have a painting of a scene of that. Because it was a moment where you actually saw the true character of the neighborhood.
Lurking beneath the surface of coordinated chaos, there was deep shock, pain, and fear. The feeling that your home has been invaded, and that just when you might feel most at ease or safe, you're reminded that some people never want you to feel that way. Joel waited for the cops to arrive, while the perpetrator sat nearby. He watched the man practicing what he was going to say to the police.
I was noticing his body language, where I could see he connected to the spirit of what he was doing. And then in another second, he was just in his 70s and exhausted.
Even in this moment, Joel wanted to feel compassion for the man.
I thought, is it too hopeful for me to even, do I see regret? Is that just wishful thinking that there's some humanity left in this person that they could actually regret?
It took almost an hour for the police to arrive and arrest the attacker. But he continued to make racist statements and expressed no remorse. Now he awaits trial, after being charged with hate crime and malicious mischief felonies. But the attack is one example of the many threats the CID is facing. This is a BIPOC neighborhood that sits on lucrative Seattle real estate. The CID was recently listed as one of this country's 11 most endangered places. It's imperiled by development without community consultation, economic growth over human growth, and city policies made for rather than with the neighborhood. But the CID has no intention of giving in.
As much as the CID itself was formed out of redlining, it also has this incredible history of successful activism that's led to affordable housing and housing reforms. So there's something really incredibly dynamic about the dance between all of these threats infrastructure projects and government tend to throw at the neighborhood. But there's almost always this empowered response. But having said that, there's also a breaking point. Because you can beat something down long enough and at some point it might not come back up.
Joel's vision for the future builds on the Wing Luke's existing resources, the community, the ethos, the building itself, to strengthen the CID. To this end, the Wing has been involved with reinvestment in the neighborhood. This unique and holistic vision builds on the innovation of the community advisory model by reflecting on what the neighborhood wants and most needs. It's a vision that continues to position the museum as a major actor in the ongoing well-being of the CID.
We're taking it a step further, and we're saying that arts and culture work actually serves as a healing resource, that arts and culture has a way of making better government, better economies, and better health. It's what we've always done, but we're really taking it, centering it, celebrating it, and taking it to another level for the next 55 years.
The Wing Luke is built on innovative visions, community contributions, and personal stories. Joel says that people usually go to museums to see things.
Well, we're a museum that sees you right back. And when you get seen, especially if you're from a marginalized community, it does something to empower you, to remind you of your innate wellness and your agency. The museum has been very good at showing people the fullness of who they are and inviting them to widen that aperture even more. So we're just going to take that and run.
This is the last episode of our season. Thanks to all of you who have listened to and supported 10,000 Things. These are important stories to me, because we need stories that question and undo stereotypes to make space for more complex histories and lived experiences. We hope to be back for another season. Please keep an eye on this feed for more updates, and if you'd like to support our work, there's a link in the show notes to make a contribution to KUOW. And thank you. 10,000 Things is produced by KUOW in Seattle, a member of the NPR network. Our host, writer, and creator is me, Shin-Yi Pai. Whitney Henry Lester produced this episode. Jim Gates is our editor. The show art is designed by Eason Yang. Original music is by Tomo Nakayama. Our production team includes Michaela Giannotti-Boyle, Hans Tweit, Amelia Peacock, Brendan Sweeney, and Marshall Eisen. If you like this podcast, KUOW has a lot more great audio for you. Search KUOW in your podcast app and see what piques your interest. And as always, thanks for listening.
At Soundside, we bring you news and conversation rooted in the Pacific Northwest. Hi, I'm Libby Denkman. I think of my job hosting Soundside as, number one, asking tough questions of powerful people, the questions you, KUOW listeners, want answered. And two, bringing you a daily slice of the fascinating, confounding, and often goofy side of life in Washington State. Join me for Soundside at noon and 8 p.m. on KUOW or anytime on the Soundside podcast.